Hello, Happy New Year. Today is January 16th, 2018, and welcome to the first Staying Connected podcast of 2018. I'm Joe Schmidt, a project director at Tech Caliber Consulting, and I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Theresa Knutson, who is also a project director at TC2, and Andrew Brown, the managing partner at LB3, and he's also chairman of TC2. And we are here to discuss what in the heck is going on with the Universal Service Fund. 2018 began with the not so great news that the USF contribution factor hit an all-time high of 19.5%. That eye-popping number is going to impose a hefty fee on enterprise customers' telecom bills in the coming quarter. And it will most likely continue to increase in the coming years without some big changes in the USF program. Now, TC2 and LB3, we care a lot about what our clients pay for telecom services, and USF is a big part of what they pay each month. So we want to follow up on our September podcast where we discuss carrier fees and surcharges, and then today discuss why USF is costing so much money for end users and what you can do to deal with it going forward. So Andrew, let me start with you. You've been working on USF issues for over a decade. Can you explain what the heck is going on?
Well, yes, I can. So what's going on is just a continuation of a long-standing trend of steady growth in USF contribution factor. The factor, as you guys know, was something like 3% back in the late 1990s, and it's just continued to grow over the past 2 decades to the current record level of just under 20%. And the reason that it has grown like it has, and the reason it will continue to grow like it has, is because of a structural flaw in the funding mechanism of USF. It's what we affectionately call the USF death spiral.
Well, all right. Whoa. So that does sound quite grim. What is this death spiral? Can you explain that?
Yes, I can explain that too. And it's probably less exciting than the name, but it's pretty simple. There are 2 parts to USF, how much it spends each year and how much it collects to cover what it spends. And the spending part is pretty easy to understand. USF gives telecom carriers something like $8 to $9 billion a year. All of it goes to carriers so that they can provide subsidized service to certain kinds of end users and entities, folks that live in rural areas or places where it's expensive to provide service, to schools and libraries, to low-income folks who need help in paying for telephone service. A little bit goes to hospitals and rural healthcare centers.
So that's the outgoing money. How's it collected?
Right, good. So that's the second part. To cover the $8 or $9 billion, telecom service providers have to contribute into USF. They're assessed a fee, kind of like a tax, on the revenues for certain kinds of services that they provide, specifically their revenues for interstate and international telecommunications services. So the death spiral, as it is affectionately known, occurs when the fund spends more, which it has over time and it's projected to continue doing. And the carriers collect less in revenues for the accessible service, which they also have over time. If you think about, for example, how much less our clients pay in long distance services every year. So to keep up with the increasing expenditures, at the same time the base of revenues is decreasing, the factor just has to keep growing. It's pretty just basic math at that point.
So that brings us to today's near 20% figure, which the carriers just pass through to the customers.
Exactly. Just pass it through. They have to pay into USF, so they look for someone else to fund it, and they just happen to have monthly sources of revenue in their customer bases. So that's a good place to get it. So many of them just collect it on the other end by providing the subsidized service. So the government kind of acts as a clearinghouse for the transfer of this money from one group of carrier customers to another, and enterprise customers are typically, not exclusively, net contributors to the fund.
So, Theresa, you see what Andrew's talking about directly on our clients' invoices. What's the real quantifiable impact?
Well, it does vary from client to client, obviously, but in all cases, it's very significant, especially when you're talking about contribution factors that are between 15 and 20%. So as Andrew mentioned, USF is assessed on carriers' revenues for interstate and international telecom services. So this includes interstate, international voice usage. It also includes domestic network access, local services. So think about things like big ILEC dedicated access rings. They have USF, and even certain usage from wireless devices. So that's the base that really the carriers apply USF to. But do note that most suppliers do not charge USF on domestic MPOS ports or internet ports. And USF is not assessed on any purely international services.
So this increase that's near a 20% number, can you quantify it for me? So, comparing to last quarter or last year, what does it really mean to an enterprise?
Sure. So, well, again, to repeat, Andrew's phrase, it's really basic math. So if you spent $10 million in services that were subject to USF in 2017, your USF surcharges totaled $1.75 million. For that same $10 million group of services in 2018, your USF will be $1,950,000. So you're looking at about a $200,000 increase on the same $10 million year over year. Your services haven't changed, just USF has gotten larger.
So that's not chump change.
It really isn't, and it's real money. So if USF continues to increase, and as Andrew promises that it will, if something doesn't change, the impact to your overall U.S. transport budget can be really significant, especially if you're an entity that spends multiples of $10 million a year in USF-able transport services.
So, this presents the potential for an unpleasant surprise if you don't plan for it.
Oh, absolutely. And, we understand the pressure that companies are under regarding managing their transport costs. It's tremendous. And USF can change quarterly, and as we've talked about, it's typically moved upwards over time. So budgeting and forecasting is really dicey. So my suggestion is you work with your accounting team, or if you have a TEM provider, and see if you can create separate GL accounts to track your base usage charges from your telecom-related regulatory and tax charges. And just having that visibility will make your explanations of your budget variances a bit easier. So if you can go to your CFO and say, look, I spent $10 million last year in services, that's what I'm spending this year, but my taxes and regulatory fees have gone up, that's an easier discussion to have than without that data. So this increase in USF also means if you are going to actively go to market, you absolutely need to model the USF savings on the savings that you achieve related to those base service prices. So focus on negotiating approved rate on services that are subject to USF, and you get a bigger bang for your buck.
So there's a downstream effect on non-U.S. carrier fees, isn't there?
Oh my gosh, it's, you get this, and I tell you this, everyone's probably going to just shake their head, but in reality, non-USF carrier fees count as revenue to the carrier, and they're also assessed USF. So these non-USF carrier fees have names like property tax allotment or administrative expense fees, and they're also assessed USF. So as the base USF factor increases, it has a trickle-down impact to these other incremental additive fees that are charged by the carriers.
So, it seems like one of the obvious strategies is that, if you're an end user, you probably want to migrate away from services that are assessed USF to those that are not. So I know over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a lot with our clients. I'm sure the listening audience has read a lot about services like hybrid SD-WAN opportunities. And one of the financial incentives for companies to migrate to these lower cost transformational network designs like SD-WAN is to utilize services that aren't assessed USF today, like consumer grade broadband. So it seems like a good idea, but as Andrew and you have suggested, it's going to accelerate this death spiral. Is that right, Andrew? And what's the likely response if that's going to happen?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's regulatory arbitrage, so it sounds really exciting, but it does aggravate the death spiral that we talked about earlier. And that's why there's real concern right now that there's a cliff of sorts where people head toward the exits away from the assessed services, if you will, and the funding just disappears because the revenue base is so low because nobody's buying those services anymore. And that makes the required assessment on the remaining base just huge. So the problem right now is that non-business customers effectively undercontribute to USF. They've pretty much already moved to services like wireless and VoIP and internet broadband that don't contribute very much to USF, or they don't contribute at all. And businesses haven't been able to do that as easily. But SD-WAN presents an opportunity to really start using some services like consumer broadband, which you just mentioned, that aren't assessed USF. And if no change is made in the assessment methodology, we're looking at growth in the factor to the high 20s, maybe even pushing up to 30% within a relatively short period of time, like 3 to 5 years. So even those numbers probably understate the problem if there's a big transition to non-assessed services and if no change is made in the way the contributions are collected.
So that's pretty outrageous. How do businesses get some type of long-term relief?
By expressing that outrage and demanding action. No, seriously, that's how the change is going to happen, because business users are a little bit invisible in this process right now. We work with a group of enterprise customers called the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee, which is a group of very large and concerned enterprise customers that provides input and analysis to the FCC on USF issues. And business users that want relief from this really need to get involved and amplify the call for action. Otherwise, they're just going to be considered deep pockets to continue funding the current system. Joining Ad Hoc is one way, but talking to folks at LB3 for specific courses of action is another. In the absence of hearing from real businesses with real concerns, though, there's not going to be much action. And again, they're just going to view enterprise customers as deep pockets that give carriers even more money than they're already taking from you to provide service.
Well, this has been really informative. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Theresa. Clearly this is a key issue for enterprises, and it's gotten more important, and it sounds like it's become quite expensive. And if you're the listener, if you'd like to learn more about USF, as Andrew said, contact LB3. Or if you'd like to talk about other telecom or ICT lifecycle needs, you can check out LB3's or TC2's websites. You can follow us on Twitter. You can check us out on LinkedIn, shoot us a message, or just please give us a call.